When we talk about suicide missions in World War II, most people immediately think of Japanese kamikaze pilots crashing their planes into American ships at Okinawa in 1945. For many, this kind of self-sacrifice is seen as an exclusively Japanese phenomenon, unsurprising for a nation that viewed surrender as the ultimate shame and dying in battle as the highest expression of both manhood and loyalty to their divine emperor. In other words, one could not live with the shame of defeat. However, and to the surprise of many, the Japanese were not the only ones to adopt this kamikaze-style tactic. The Germans also resorted to it during the final phase of the war. Even though these kinds of operations were only implemented near the end of the war, the idea actually emerged much earlier. In fact, suicide missions involving a manned aircraft intentionally crashing into a specific target were first proposed well before D-Day and the Allied landings in France in the summer of 1944. The idea was first raised in February 1944 by two officers. One of them was the famous German commando leader, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. Among his many exploits, he had led the daring rescue of the deposed Benito Mussolini from his mountaintop prison at Gran Sasso in 1943, using glider troops and paratroopers. These missions were called total missions, a name reflecting the absolute commitment expected of the pilot to achieve a crucial objective at the cost of their life. Skorzeny proposed forming a suicide squad around the same time as Colonel Joachim Hermann, a high-ranking Luftwaffe officer and Knight's Cross recipient who at the time was Inspector General of Night Fighters. Hermann advocated for ramming enemy bombers directly with their aircraft. By this stage of the war, Germany was being relentlessly bombed by Allied air forces, and the Luftwaffe was powerless to defend its skies. This led to the search for a radical solution, something that might spread panic among the enemy's bomber formations. It appears that the concept of a volunteer suicide unit was an attempt to harness the fanatical dedication of some Luftwaffe pilots, drawing from Germanic mythology and the ideal of noble sacrifice. These pilots would make the ultimate sacrifice for their country and for the Führer, hoping to compensate for the Luftwaffe's overwhelming numerical disadvantage as it struggled to halt the Allied bombing campaign. Amazingly, a number of young pilots did volunteer for this kamikaze-style unit. Perhaps even more astonishing is the fact that it was a woman who convinced a reluctant Hitler to greenlight Skorzeny and Hermann's extreme proposal. Contrary to popular belief, Hitler did not approve the creation of these suicide units in early 1944. Doing so might have seemed like admitting that the war was already lost. That woman was Hanna Reitsch, Germany's top test pilot, a fearless aviator admired by Hitler and deeply committed to the Third Reich. She was one of only 3 women awarded the Iron Cross First Class, and the only woman to receive the Golden Pilot Observer badge with diamonds. Earlier in the war, Reitsch had test-piloted aircraft like the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka and the Dornier Du-17, and earned her Iron Cross by flying the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor. She survived multiple crash landings with the Comet. Reitsch believed suicide attacks could be effective against Allied ships, essentially the same tactic the Japanese would later adopt in the Pacific in November 1944. In search of a suitable aircraft for such missions, she proposed using the Messerschmitt Me 328. Originally designed as a cheap escort fighter, the Me-328 was meant to be towed to high altitude, released, and then dive toward enemy bombers using 2 pulsajet engines taken from the V-1 missile. However, these pulsajets performed poorly at medium and high altitudes due to lower air pressure. Reitsch had personally flown a glider version of the Me-328, which, carrying a 900 kilograms bomb beneath its fuselage, could silently dive onto Allied ships. In total, 9 Me-328 aircraft were built, but none ever saw combat. On the other hand, and despite Hitler's initial refusal, Heinrich Himmler approved Reitsch's plan. However, the Luftwaffe High Command was naturally hesitant, and even Hermann Göring showed little interest in the project. Nevertheless, on February 28, 1944, Hanna Reitsch personally presented her suicide operation proposal to Hitler at his private Alpine residence. While Hitler did not yet believe the military situation was dire enough to justify such an extreme measure, Reitsch managed to convince him. The Führer then ordered the project to be handed over to General Günther Korten, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff. The unit was nicknamed the Leonidas Squadron, a reference to King Leonidas II of Sparta, who in 480 BC heroically defended the pass at Thermopylae with just 300 men against a Persian army of 100,000, fighting to the last man. The squadron was incorporated into Kampfgeschwader 200, a special operations wing responsible for testing captured enemy aircraft, deploying spies, and other clandestine missions. To form the Leonidas Squadron, 70 volunteers were recruited. Each of them signed a declaration stating, "I hereby voluntarily request to be part of the suicide group as the human component of a glider bomb. I fully understand that this role will result in my own death." At this point, the Me-328 project was abandoned, and attention shifted to a manned version of the V-1 missile called the Fieseler F-103R. The standard V-1, an unmanned flying bomb, was modified to include a small enclosed cockpit and a reinforced front panel. Its wings were also given hardened edges to cut through anti-aircraft balloon cables. The launch method involved carrying two manned V-1Cs underneath a Heinkel. He-111 bomber, which would release them near their targets. In an attempt to avoid making the mission entirely suicidal, the V-1 cockpit was fitted with an ejection system, allowing the pilot to aim the aircraft at the enemy and, optimistically, bail out at the last moment. However, due to the cockpit's proximity to the pulse jet intakes, survival odds were estimated at less than 1%. Several training flights were conducted using unpowered glider versions. The first launch took place in September 1944 at Rechlin, but ended in disaster when the pilot accidentally fell from the canopy. Hanna Reitsch herself performed several test flights and survived multiple crash landings. Still, Lieutenant Colonel Werner Baumbach, commander of Kampfgeschwader 200, was firmly opposed to the project. In October 1944, he succeeded in canceling it in favor of the Mistel project, even though 175 manned V-1 units had already been built. Mistel, which means mistletoe in German, was not a suicide weapon. It involved a composite aircraft system, a small piloted plane mounted on top of an unmanned bomber loaded with explosives. The pilot would release the lower aircraft and guide it toward the target before escaping to continue fighting. Mistel units were used on the Eastern Front in 1945 and in some Western attacks, but their impact was minimal and they were easy targets for Allied fighters. Because the Mistel program didn't require suicide pilots, the Leonidas Squadron was put on hold, at least until the final days of the war. During the early stages of the Battle of Berlin, the Leonidas Squadron was reactivated. Their mission: destroy the bridges over the Oder River that had been captured by the advancing Red Army. Between April 17th and April 20th, 1945, a total of 35 suicide missions were flown. No special aircraft or modified V-1S were used. Instead, available fighter planes such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 were employed. The Luftwaffe later claimed that 17 bridges were destroyed, though this number is likely exaggerated. The only confirmed destruction was the railway bridge at Küstrin. All 35 German pilots who participated in these missions died instantly, causing some disruption in Soviet supply lines. However, by April 20th, the Red Army had reached the airfield from which the unit operated, and the Leonidas Squadron ceased all operations. Still, although this unit never flew again, the Luftwaffe launched one last desperate attack on April 24th, sending around 250 aircraft into battle near Berlin. With its capital surrounded by the Red Army, the remaining German air forces near Berlin launched a final assault against the columns of Soviet tanks and trucks advancing toward the heart of the Reich. The German offensive took advantage of the heavy congestion of Soviet troops on the roads leading into Berlin, managing to destroy 11 tanks and 243 enemy motor vehicles. No official reports were made regarding Luftwaffe losses, but they were likely significant in this desperate life-or-death operation. So, what did you think of this last-ditch effort by the Germans? If you'd like to explore how the Luftwaffe carried out its final attack of World War II, I've left that video linked in the description below. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you next Sunday. Take care and see you soon.